Thank you very much for joining. This is the New York Financial Writers Association. It's our first inaugural reporting club event where we're going to be inviting journalists to come on and chat to our members about inspirational enterprise stories that we've seen. And for the first event tonight, we have Jesse Barron joining, and I'm really glad that he's here today. I hope those who are on had a chance to read his story. For some background, the New York Financial Writers is the oldest journalism organization in America, and every year we hand out scholarships to aspiring financial journalism students, and we also hold events like this one. And my name's Olivia, and I'm on the board of NIFWA. So I just kind of want to jump straight in to Jesse's piece. Obviously, it was called What Happened Inside Ed Buck's Apartment, and this was a long-form magazine feature that ran in the New York Times magazine publication. And this story, as I read it, it kind of had so many different layers to it, from drug addiction to prostitution to power to money to lies to media misinformation to predatory racial profiling. And as a reader, I just felt like, Jesse, you had an incredible ability to kind of layer all that together and tell a really powerful narrative without really sensationalizing some of these details. So I'd love to just kick off by asking you to explain how you kind of came up with the idea to pitch this story. Obviously, it was a local crime story that had been covered by other media at the time. So what made you think this is a good article or this is a good idea to kind of pitch to the New York Times Magazine?
Well, I think, first of all, thank you so much for having me here. And thank you to everyone who's hanging out with us. So the short, concise answer to that question is a very unsatisfying one, which is that it was my ex-wife and now friend Sarah's idea to pursue this story. But the longer, more complicated explanation is that at any given moment, and I think most magazine writers are doing this, you're sort of looking at multiple things. There's multiple leads, multiple stories. So at any moment, I'm sort of half pursuing 3 or 4 different things, not knowing, what will come of it. And this was a story that we sort of knew about in LA in the winter of 2019, because 2 men had died at Buck's apartment and there had been no arrest. So this wasn't a secret story by any means. This was a story that was in the LA Times and at the local television affiliates. It was a story that had attracted a lot of activist attention, and activists were asking journalists to look at the story. So this was not a secret, hard to find topic or situation, but it was a very local one. So when I started looking into it, it seemed like it would be maybe a 3,000 or 4,000 word kind of local crime story. And when I initially pitched it and got it assigned, it was as a 4,000 word story, and it ran at about 8,000. And so in the process of reporting, as I kept turning things over, the story got longer and longer. And I would report into one avenue of it, like the history of West Hollywood, and then it would become obvious that there had to be a whole section about the history of West Hollywood, or the ballroom house that Jamel was a member of, or the district attorneys and the former U.S. attorneys who speak about the law enforcement. So each time I started to pursue one avenue, the story got longer. But the initial the initial impulse was because there was this event that was really hard to explain, which was that 2 men had died in an apartment in West Hollywood. Activists like Jasmine Canick and Letitia Nixon, the mother of Jamel Moore, people like Wes Siegmiller from the Sex Workers Outreach Project. There were all of these activists in the community who wanted people to look at this. And it was an invitation as a journalist to look at something that seemed troubling and important as a sort of example of racial injustice and maybe the criminal justice system malfunctioning in LA. But at the beginning, that was it. That was all I had. I did not have anything about the megadonor narrative or any of the other stuff that's in the story. It was just responding to what seemed like a really hard to explain series of events.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like the pitch really evolved over time as you started digging into it. And can you explain your process when you're approaching an ambitious project like this? How do you actually go about taking down notes, recording interviews, gathering all of this evidence? Like, what does your system look like?
Sure. So I I use really simple basic tools. So I actually can't see myself, but let me see if I can.
I
Okay,
can
here we
see
go.
that.
Okay, good. So I basically use these reporters notebooks for notes. I use this, which I highly recommend everyone get. This is a tool that records landline phone calls. So if you have a landline at your desk, which I do, you can go straight from the landline into an MP3 recorder. So I record almost all my phone calls onto an MP3 recorder. And then I use Dropbox to organize documents and recordings and tapes. So it's nothing fancy, but I started as a fact checker at Harper's, 7 years ago, and it was really ingrained to me that you can make your life a complete living hell if your notes and documents are a mess going into fact checking. And having been the person that made other people's lives hell, I am very careful to try to limit that in my own life. So I try to keep things super organized and separated in a Dropbox so that by the time I get to fact checking, I'm just handing off this folder that already looks like an organized map of where the documents and underlying material is for the story. But it's purely out of terror of not wanting to fall on the wrong side of a fact checker. It's pure fear.
Great. And so you were a freelancer when you wrote this story for the magazine, right? And
yes.
What was your relationship like with your editors as the reporting process evolved?
So I have a pretty close relationship with my editor at the magazine, Willie Staley, and that's a relationship that we've developed for 4 or 5 years now. I think this is my seventh or eighth story for the magazine. So I feel comfortable bouncing stuff off him and trying dumb ideas on him. And this was a story that I pitched in the summer of 2019, and he kind of took a flyer on it because Buck had not been arrested. It was not clear, the extent of the extent of the material wasn't obvious. But just like the real talk, no bullshit answer is like when they hear they don't have to buy a plane ticket and that they're not losing money reporting, you have a huge advantage. So I live in LA. I'm here all the time. I was not asking for a budget except for like $500 to transcribe tapes. So the risk was really low for them. And it gave me the opportunity to spend a long time developing the material. And the payoff, I think, was big. I hope it was big, for this story. But at the beginning, it was a short assignment, and the risk for them was just so low that they decided to run with it.
Mm-hmm. And as the kind of deadline kept getting stretched out, was there any concern about how long it would go on for, like how long the reporting process would take?
Yes, that's a great question, and takes me back to moments of like complete terror with this piece. Yes, I think that absolutely happened, and I think the initial deadline was 3 or 4 months after the piece was assigned. I blew past that. Eventually the piece took 1.5 years to report, and it's a series of decisions, when a piece like this is getting close, because with a crime story, there's sort of 2 acts. There's the actual crime and the investigation and the arrest, and then there's the legal process. And often those 2 things take place in totally different phases. So a trial could be years after the event, right? So Buck has not even been tried yet. The trial has not even started. So you have to decide when you're doing a crime piece, at least I feel like I have to decide whether you're going to cut it after the investigation and arrest, or whether you're going to go and cover the entire trial. And in this case, it felt like we had so much material by the time the arrest happened that we had to finish it and get in ahead of the trial. So that's what we did. But it's definitely a conversation that we had, and it's not a clear-cut thing. Every piece, that's a decision you have to make if there's going to be a trial.
And are you going to continue to cover the trial for the Times?
Unclear. I might. I'm gonna go, and it sort of depends what the actual trial is like.
Mm-hmm. And as you were reporting the story out, was there anything that surprised you that kind of came out of the blue that you weren't expecting as you went down all these rabbit holes?
So many things. I mean, I think one of the biggest surprises to me was that when I came into this story, and for those of you who maybe haven't read it or aren't familiar with it, this story was basically reported in most media as a story about a white Democratic mega donor whose power and connection to the Democratic Party had shielded him in Los Angeles from the consequences of murdering these two Black men who had died in his apartment 18 months apart. That's how this story was reported. And so when I came into it, that's what I thought the story was. I thought that this was a story about a Democratic power broker mega donor. And over the course of my reporting, I kept running up against problematic things that I couldn't understand. Like, he was living in a rent-controlled apartment for $1,100 a month, but he was a power broker in the Democratic Party. And I would just sort of file these things away in my mind as sort of loose threads that I couldn't tie up. And it wasn't until I pulled all of the donations off of the elections databases and California elections databases and so on, and I actually was going into my drawer to find this thing that I made of his political contributions, which I don't know if everyone can see, but I basically charted out how much money he had donated over the course of his whole career. And the big flash that I had after doing all of this is that it wasn't enough money, that the mega donor story was a sort of, to some extent, was a narrative pushed by Fox and by other more liberal media too. And then I had to think why it was that that story had become so compelling and so powerful, and that kind of propelled the ending of the piece.
Mm-hmm. I think that that's such a fascinating element of this story, and I actually cut and paste a particular section that I wanted to read out tonight. It says, for Fox, the donor story was political bait. For the white liberals who also embraced it, the donor story did subtler work. It obscured the reality of the race and class of the victims. It was easier to believe that Ed Buck had enormous power than to confront the fact that Jamal Moore had so little. And I felt like that was, a lasting takeaway for me reading the story, at least, was that oftentimes when we see big kind of crime stories, you're writing about one specific case, a victim and a perpetrator, and it's not really relatable, or it's not going to happen time and time again. But this story was really a reflection on like inequality and social justice and just wider kind of society. And how did you discover that you were kind of getting closer to this bigger picture piece that was beyond just kind of, reporting about this one case?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'm so glad that you took that away from it. I think it emerged out of the reporting. I think if at least for me, if I stick with something long enough, and I tend to just go really slowly and take a long time, partly because I'm just sort of like slow and maybe not as smart as people who can perceive a lot of stuff really. Like, I need to go kind of like slowly and let things unfold. And the downside is that it takes me like a year and a half to finish a magazine story. But the upside is that often you discover more depth just because you sit with something for so long. And so this was something that emerged out of this realization that the money was just not there, that there just was not, that the main media story that had been presented that most people knew about this guy just didn't quite seem to hold up in the way that the other reporters or the anchors and so on had kind of presented it. And then the question is, why is that story so compelling? What is that story concealing? And when I started to talk to, there's sections in the piece about, and when, so what is that story concealing? And it's concealing, obviously, that the power that Buck had derived not from being, a Reed Hastings or a Laurene Powell Jobs or a Tom Steyer, but from having much more basic advantages in Los Angeles that people don't talk about as much, which is like having a house when other people don't, being white, having money on hand for a lawyer, and these very basic things that are so basic they're almost scary to confront as being as important as they are. That was the kind of power that Buck had. And then when I started to interview sex workers and other men who had done sex work for Buck, one of whom is interviewed at length in the piece, it started to become obvious that this kind of power was wielded in LA all the time, not just necessarily by Buck. But all of that stuff emerged out of the reporting and out of conversations with Sarah, my ex-wife, who I always worked closely with, and we would sort of go over the material together. And this stuff emerges very naturally if it's honestly come by. But I had no idea when I started this piece that I would find any of that, and you never know. That's the risk, but it's also what makes it fun.
And another interesting element of this story is that it had been reported, by a lot of different media outlets before you jumped on
Right.
it. And I wonder, when you're approaching journalists and asking them to talk to you as a journalist, was that kind of weird? And did they approach you with, suspicion? Were they afraid of the piece that you were doing, or did they think that, they didn't really understand why you were asking them questions about the way in which they reported this?
That is a great question. Yeah, I think that the journalists who participated in the piece were, for the most part, people who had written about the story years ago. So this was a situation where they had already done their pieces. Their pieces had been shared, had been linked to, had been read in many cases. So it didn't feel like I was stealing something from them. I was doing something much different because I was coming in much later. So I don't think they were too suspicious about it. And I think there's also, I mean, everyone on this call is a journalist or studying journalism, I think, in some way. And it's like the outlets kind of start to matter. This is a little bit of a gross thing to say, I guess, but like a magazine piece has a very different territory than a newspaper piece has a very different territory than a television piece. So if I'm covering in a magazine piece journalists who wrote on like online newspapers, we're in a very different role. They're breaking news as it happens, and I'm trying to zoom out and take a longer view. So it didn't feel like we were directly competing. And for the most part, I think people were eager to share their work.
Right. Well, I'd also like to just say to everyone on the call, feel free to drop in any questions for Jessie by either putting your hand up and Britt will let you in, or writing into the chat function, and I'll make sure to ask them. So just getting into specifics now, there are so many details in this story that as I was reading it, I just, asked myself, how did he get that? Or how is it that he happened to be right there when that happened? Or where did he find that information from? One example would be near the top of the story when you're explaining, I think it's with the first victim when the police arrived or the officials arrived on the scene. And you talked about how the deputies were looking around Buck's apartment and that he was standing outside with his neighbor. And you wrote, for a moment, Buck leaned his head on the neighbor's back with a heaviness that suggested exhaustion. The neighbor was crying. And there's no way that you could have been there at the time to see that. It's very unlikely that police would write with any kind of detail in a report, something like that. So I wonder, how did you get these specific details? Where did you find them?
So I can't actually say where I got that particular detail because there's a source behind that who's a protected source. But I can answer, a little more generally in a way that might be, sort of useful. Getting like basically like when there's a crime and a death, it spits out a lot of documents. It spits out a coroner's report, a coroner's investigator's report, news accounts, and so on. And so so there's like sort of a first level of detail that is available that you can file records requests for, and so on. But then often there's like a second layer of detail that hasn't been sucked in by those reports, and that would be something like eyewitness accounts or interviews with deputies, surveillance footage. There's this whole other world of material. And so often I'm answering this in such a vague way because I can't actually just directly answer it. And I'm so sorry that I can't, but you're just trying to figure out who is going to be close enough that is invisible in the coroner's reports and in the coroner's investigators reports. Whose names are you not seeing? Right? Which roles are not speaking. And so if you can imagine enough of those, a small handful of those will be your sort. There's more people who saw this thing than are named in this. So who are those people? But I can't specifically reveal the exact person who provided that detail, but that's the general idea.
Okay,
Sorry,
understood
that's an
on that. But
unsatisfying answer. Yeah.
no worries. I've got another kind of related question to that. Is you talk about how you tried to track down this individual named S, and that he was
Right.
homeless and he was difficult to find. And
Right.
I wonder, how did you encourage him to talk? What specific techniques did you use that ended up with you having a conversation with him when someone is like not that easy, to pin down?
Right. So S, for anyone who doesn't remember the piece or hasn't read it, is a sex worker who went to Ed Buck's apartment 7 times and was paid to do drugs, to shoot meth in Buck's apartment. And he's interviewed in the piece, and he's an important part of the piece because his story corroborates a lot of what we have been hearing about what went on in Buck's apartment, the way that he would slam guys with meth and pay them to do more and more. And so he's sort of the eyewitness to that behavior, because he in fact was one of these men that Buck would pay to shoot meth in the apartment. So I got to him because, again, like partly a function of just hanging out for so long, I got to know an activist. I think I mentioned this very briefly in the piece, in the sex worker community. And one day he invited me to a talk that he was doing at the at the library. And the next day he would call me to chat. And the next day, I would call him and ask him questions. And most of that material didn't make it into the piece. It was just me getting deeper and deeper into his world and learning from him and being connected to other sources. And one day my phone rang and he said, this guy is at my house having lunch. Do you want to talk to him? And it took a couple times for us to meet. He would make an appointment and then he wouldn't make it because he's homeless and his life is super difficult and it's not so simple to like meet a journalist. But it came through someone that he trusted. Mm-hmm. So I wasn't just cold approaching him. It was a relationship that I had made with someone during the course of my reporting that ultimately led to that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Really interesting. And another point that I wanted to touch on tonight is I feel like usually in a story like this, there's a clear villain. Buck is the villain. He's the villainous character that we have. Mm-hmm. But you also make other agencies and people out to be pretty unsavory. There's a lot of criticism loaded toward the way the district attorney handled it or the way the police handled the initial investigation. And I want to just point out that there is a point in the story where you circle back to something you said earlier when the deputies are at Buck's house and they're investigating the first death, and there's a young black man who arrives, and one of the deputies, looks over and says, "Hey, store's closed," and he walks away. And later in the story, you write, "I kept thinking of the second young black man who arrived at North Laurel that night. Here was a potential witness walking straight into the hands of the police, a man who could have eventually been a victim himself, but the sheriff's deputies didn't even interview him. They told him store's closed." What store? The customer was Buck. So you actually, leave a lot of, criticism at the hands of authorities as well. And I wonder if you can just talk a little bit about that decision in your reporting process.
One of the strangest things about this story is that it was not only was it not a secret after Jamel Moore's death, it was not a secret before Jamel Moore's death. In other words, people in West Hollywood who were in Buck's orbit kind of knew that he, had a thing for young black guys, many of whom were homeless, and that he was a drug addict. The thing that was not so widely reported or not accepted was that there was an element of sort of coercive drug use, of paying people to inject high doses. That had not, activists had heard about that, and the sex worker community. Is this the idea
of slamming?
Slamming, exactly.
Yeah. Could you describe what that is while you're talking about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So, methamphetamine comes in, crystal methamphetamine comes in sort of crystalline shards. And if you use meth intravenously, you crush the shards into powder. and you put the powder into a syringe, into the chamber of a syringe, and you add water, and the powder dissolves and goes clear. And then you tie off, you put the needle in your arm, and you, what they call aspirate the vein, meaning you draw back the plunger to see if it fills with blood, to see if you've hit a vein. And if you have, then you shoot the dose. And people who do meth call that process of shooting it slamming. And Ed Buck, the guy who my piece is about partly, had a sexual fetish for loading up the chamber with a high dose of meth and then paying a sex worker to shoot that high dose, or in some cases, allegedly shooting the dose himself. And the reason why this is so important is that because you'll remember the shards, when they dissolve in water as powder, are clear. So you can't tell the difference between a dose that's very high and a dose that's low. And that becomes very important in the piece because it goes to what it was that these men could have known about the drugs that they were using when they were at Buck's apartment. So people kind of knew that there was this scene in Buck's apartment. And in LA, there's a death from meth overdose every single day. It's a prevalent problem and it's rampant in the gay community. So this is a major problem among gay men of color, among gay white men, and more broadly in Los Angeles. And sheriffs absolutely know this and coroners absolutely know this. So all of that was known before Jamel Moore died, that there was a meth problem, that it was prevalent in the gay community, and that Buck had this interest in these young guys and that he would do drugs with them because there was a traffic in and out of his apartment of these young sex workers. And so the question becomes, why is it that everyone was so desensitized to this that it was going on without Buck ever being arrested, even for possession? And I guess, possession is now sort of decriminalized in LA, but he was distributing, and if you go down to South LA, Black men in LA are arrested for distributing, for selling. So what is it that was protecting Buck? And it wasn't that he was a megadonor, as we learned. And one of the things that I felt like became clear in my reporting, thanks partly to all of these activists who had done a lot of this work, is that it was a kind of casual protection, a kind of invisible protection. In other words, it wasn't some vast organized conspiracy of political parties. It was just like people looking the other way because a white guy in West Hollywood was doing this stuff. And the peak example of this moment is when, on the night that this young man dies of an overdose and is found naked in this guy's apartment with a puncture in his forearm, and there's drug paraphernalia and porn on the television, and it's clear what the relationship between these two men is. This is a John-client relationship that ended in an overdose. That night, as the coroners are searching Buck's apartment, a second young Black man, walks through the gate of Laurel Avenue, and you would think that the sheriff's deputies would immediately interview that guy. That would be the first witness in your case. And instead what happened is they shoot him away. They told him store is closed. And if you really think about that remark, it reveals a whole way of seeing the situation that's an inaccurate, distorted way of seeing the situation, because there is a customer, right? But the customer is Buck, who's buying sex and buying drugs. Mm-hmm. And so what it speaks to me is that you don't need this big, vast political conspiracy so much as you need this kind of unspoken, invisible permissiveness and understanding between the cops and the sheriff's deputies and West Hollywood. And Buck is just one example of that, but I'm sure that stuff like that is happening tonight in West Hollywood.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And as a white male journalist approaching, right, Black LGBTQ people from communities like that, and obviously you're not part of that community, how
right.
did you establish a level of trust as you were reporting?
That's a great question. I'm sorry, I'm trying to fix my little video. So it's muted. How did I establish trust? Like, I don't even know that I don't know that I did with everyone in the end, is the honest answer. I think that some people really came to trust me, and some people in the story, white and black, did not trust me. And that's to be expected in a long piece like this. The people who did trust me and who did stick with me and speak to me, this is a lot of the people who were quoted in the piece who were members of Jamel's Ballroom House and some of the sex worker community and so on. I think eventually came to came to feel comfortable, if not to totally trust me, because I basically listened to them a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I just would go for long drives with them and run a tape and talk about their lives in some cases. And I try, I learned a lot actually from talking to one of the lawyers in this case, a lot of whose clients have been in and out of jail or who are sex workers. And, he sort of taught me some stuff that was important about like being mindful of people's life situations. Like if you're going to interview someone who has like maybe been in jail, like you're probably not going to want to interview them in a room with the door is closed. Like if you're interviewing a sex worker, like take a drive because maybe they don't feel comfortable talking in a restaurant or a cafe.
Mm-hmm.
If you're interviewing someone who's homeless, like make sure that you're offering to meet them wherever they are and that they're not coming to you. There's just little basic things that go a long way that just communicate to people that you're not just in it to tell your version of the story, but that you see them as a human and you want to learn from them. But it's a challenge to remember that stuff all the time and to keep it in mind. And certainly there were many times when I failed at that reporting this piece and tripped up and was insensitive and misinterpreted for sure. But I think at a baseline, you just try to let the subject lead, when the subjects are in a vulnerable position and be mindful of the life situations. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
definitely not saying that I did that throughout in this piece. It's a constant learning experience.
Mm-hmm. And for those on this call who may not have the luxury of 18 months or a year to work on stories, is there any kind of like takeaways you would give for like very quick things that you might be able to do to try and establish trust if you don't have time to like sit with someone in a car and drive around for hours? Is there anything you found that got you an interview quicker than what you would have expected, or some of the other like long-term relationships you formed?
Well, that's a good question. I'm not sure that there's a way to do that for people in super vulnerable communities. Like I think that does require a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
relationships. But I will say that like one trick that I've learned from a friend of mine that is really useful and that is like super useful if you're doing stuff quick is that like if you sort of almost if you think you know something and you think that there's someone who uh could either confirm it or disprove it, it's not a bad thing to go to someone like fairly early in the process and just be really dumb. I think that journalists, because we like watch TV and journalism movies and all this stuff, like we get into this headspace of that like journalism is like, finding the thing in the stacks of the library and knocking on that person's door to
Mm-hmm.
confront them. But a lot of journalism is just really being dumb and being comfortable, being open and inquisitive and not having all the answers initially. And so I think when you're working, on magazine deadline and you don't have the luxury of all this stuff, I think we get into this headspace as journalists where we feel like we have to be like these killers and be really on top of it and have the, catch people off guard. And that's really not required to get good interviews. Often you can go to sources earlier than you think.
Mm-hmm. That's great advice. Thank you. And we have a question in the chat from Isabel. She's an intern at Bloomberg at the moment.
Hey,
And
Isabel.
she wrote in, I think you can probably read it, but she's asking for those on the call, how do you know when you have enough for a story? Like, you're reporting this clearly for about probably a year before you even started writing. And I'd love to get into your writing process later, but how did
Sure.
you know when to stop reporting and when to actually start writing it out? And she asks, you mentioned that earlier your deadline was obviously pushed out. So what made you
Right.
decide when the story was ready?
Well, I felt like it was partly that I felt like if I waited too long, I would get scoops on some of my original material because I knew other people were starting to look at it. And Jackie Lacey, the district attorney of LA, was up for re-election in November, and she lost actually to her challenger. And she's sort of one of the people in the piece who is not doing enough as law enforcement. So I felt like it should come out before her election because she was still in play politically, and that it had to run before the trial because I wasn't going to get into the trial. So it had to be that fall. It just, the walls close in. You just have fewer and fewer options. And you can feel it happening. Other people start to look at the story, or you hear from sources that Playboy is trying to do their own story or whatever. And then, something else is going to happen, like a trial, and you just run out of options. You have to publish, even if you take forever. So, and, as far as having enough material, I think I like to have a lot before I write. I really like to have a lot. And I've heard different anecdotes from reporters who are better than I am and more experienced than I am. Like one metric that stuck with me is like, you're done when you start knowing the answers to the questions that you're asking, and you start to hear the same stuff again and again. That's one kind of good way to have a sense that you're maybe not doing real work anymore. You're just sort of avoiding writing, which is easy to do. And I guess another way to know you're done is that the editor, the magazine starts to force your hand because they get frustrated. So everyone just gets so annoyed with you that you got to publish.
Right. And another question from Isabel. She's asking, is there any law that prevents journalists from publishing stories before a trial? And is it even possible that this story may play a role in the upcoming trial as well?
So there's no law that prevents you from publishing before a trial. There's laws that make it more difficult for sources to talk to you if they're involved in a criminal trial, but there's no law that says you can't publish before a trial. And sorry, what was the second part?
I just had a second part to that is, do you think it's possible that this story could actually play a role in the trial, that it could be used or entered as evidence?
Yeah, sometimes articles are cited in court cases. Yes, that can happen. But I'm not sure that any of the actual material is admissible. There's hearsay objections. It gets very complicated with the rules of like evidentiary procedure in American criminal law. But yeah, it's possible. Or, one way they screen jurors is like, have you formed an opinion of this story from anything in the media? So sometimes stuff comes up through there. So yeah, in an oblique way, it can interact with the trial in some way. Yeah, maybe.
And I just want to broaden this out again, and apologies, I actually should have done this at the start, but I wonder if you can talk a little bit about like stories that you've covered in the past and what beats you typically write about, because you're kind of an expert now on like slamming and drug use and addiction and all of these things. I don't know if that's something that you've been writing about for a long time, or if this was a whole new area for you.
Well, yeah, I hadn't done stuff about meth before, but I had written about criminal trials before. I did a big piece about what's known as the texting suicide trial in Massachusetts, where a young woman was convicted of manslaughter for texting her boyfriend, persuading him to kill himself. I moved to Massachusetts and covered that for 6 months. And so I had familiarity with, crime reporting, and I've written a lot about finance and about Wall Street, and I've done some pieces about private equity and the street and so on. So I had familiarity, which was really important for this piece because of the political donation sort of financial aspect of it. So I had familiarity with that piece of it, but definitely the meth and gay culture and sex work was something that I just listened to people tell me about for a long time for this piece. That was not something I knew about, but I had frameworks from other stuff I'd done. I had covered crime, I had covered finance.
And earlier you showed us like a chart that you drew of his political donations. I wonder,
Right.
can you explain in a little bit more detail how you went down that avenue and what it was like gathering all of those financial documents? We are financial reporters, so it would be
For
great to hear
sure.
about like that side of it from your
Yeah,
reporting.
absolutely. So as you guys know, most election contributions are matters of public record. The tricky part, the problem with election contributions is that there's so many concentric circles in the US. So there's city, county, state, and federal, and all of those have separate databases. And what I did when I was building out the map of his contributions was just to pull all of the donations from each of those databases and then aggregate it. I made an Excel spreadsheet for myself and I aggregated everything together. And then you can see, I don't know, let me see if I can see myself for a second to do this. So in this chart, you can see there's like different, it's like state, city, federal, county. So each bar represents another layer, another concentric circle. But it's all public. There's a database in California called Power Search, which is the Secretary of State's database. The county databases are public. Obviously, federal election donations are public. I don't have to tell you guys that. So I made myself a database. I made myself a big Excel spreadsheet with all of them, and then I guess yeah, I don't even need to complicate that question. It's not. I didn't do anything that smart.
Great. Well, thanks for that. And we've got questions here coming in from other people in the audience. So one from Sylvia here. She's wondering, how involved was your editor in the reporting process? Were you talking to your editor often, or did you mostly go it alone? And how did you navigate the ethical challenges that came up along the way? So a two-part question there.
So I was in touch with my editor a lot. And we would, and again, I was sort of working with Sarah, who also was almost an editor on the piece. So there was a lot of people I was talking to, but my relationship with my editor it's almost like, I feel like a good writer-editor relationship is a little adversarial in a friendly way, but it's a little like you're the, it should feel a little like, this is a terrible analogy because I don't want to compare what journalists do to like law enforcement, but it's a little like cop DA or something. Like, do you have enough to charge? Do you have enough to publish? That's a terrible analogy, and I don't want to compare us at all to cops and district attorneys. But there is that element, and so with Willie, we would spend a lot of time just on the phone, going back and forth over evidence and over interviews, and why did this happen? Why did this person do that? And often, just by asking me enough questions, he would hit something that I couldn't answer, and that was the next avenue to report. So I would say, oh my God, I found something so amazing. Like I found that I found that the way that these reporters first learned about the story was, 5 days after Jamel's death, and then they did this, and then this was the first reporter to publish it. And Willie might say, well, how'd they learn about it? What was the first tip? I'd say, damn it, and then I have to go report that. But that often leads to something. So you want to have someone who's really asking you a lot of questions and sort of being challenging. And
are those like weekly conversations, monthly conversations? How often do you check in?
No, I would say for this, it was more like monthly. Because an editor at a magazine like the Times is closing a magazine every week, so he does not have time to deal with like my moment-to-moment reporting crises. Yeah, so that's when it would be my wife or friends, a lot my wife for sure, and like the people who are around you when you're doing something like this become almost by default immersed in the story because it's all you can think about. But no, I mean, an editor like at a weekly magazine is dropping in and out every month or so, but basically they're closing the book every week. So they don't have time to be like, dealing with every step. Yeah.
Right. And then the end of Sylvia's question, she's asking, how did you navigate ethical challenges that came up along the way?
I mean, I don't know that I did successfully. I guess, you know, it's a challenge to do something before there's a trial because the outcome is in play in a fundamental way for the characters. It's not clear, it's not decided, and there's, two sides that, or more than two sides of people who want their version of the story to be presented. And I think, like, I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that question. I think that there's a constant effort be to be fair, but not in a bullshit, there are two sides way, in a way of like, there is the truth and it's possible to be right about something. But the bar to do that is just really high. And I'm not sure that I actually met it in this piece, but I think, like, the ethical challenges of something like this involve just being honest. And again, not like giving myself credit or saying I did this, but just being honest about the power relations that are at play. There's people in the story who have a lot of power and people in the story who do not have a lot of power. And so you have to wait. It's not the case in this story that there's like, two equally viable versions of the truth and you just have to report both of them. Right? There is something that really happened in that apartment. It is possible to know or to come close to what you think that thing is. And so you just try, I guess, to do that. And I think the trap that a lot of people fall into, especially I think now, and I sometimes find myself falling into, is like a fake sense of balance that comes from like wanting to present two sides when they might both be bullshit and one of them is bullshit. And I really don't believe that that's our job. I believe that our job is to be accurate. And I think that's its own kind of ethics.
That's a great segue, like this idea of trying to get close to the truth, particularly when the truth is subjective. Buck's truth is going to be very different from, Jamel Moore's mother's truth or even Jamel's. So I wonder, can you give us a sense of what the reaction to this piece was like from the families of the two men who died in his apartment and even other people in the story as well? How did they respond, and was it seen favorably?
Sure. So the response from the families and from Jasmine Canick, who is the main advocate for the families and is photographed in the piece and quoted in the piece, was negative. And their response was presented on a Facebook Live video, which you can find on my Twitter. I promoted it as part of the story, part of the reaction. So anyone is welcome to go and check out their reactions to it. I think their objections to it were that I was too much about Buck, too much attention on Chris Darden. They didn't like that I had included the inside of Jamel's notebook in the scene at the end, that I had looked into Jasmine's sort of hands as she was holding the notebook. Legitimate criticisms, legitimate objections. The reaction from the friends of Jamel who are in the piece, so that's Keith and Gia in the ballroom house, were positive. They felt like the piece captured their friend. And the reaction from West Hollywood was mixed. Some people felt like, the city was being portrayed in a negative light, and some people felt like it was exposing stuff that should be exposed. I mean, more broadly, the reaction was positive. The piece was widely read and well received in general, but that does not translate to sources liking it. And it's not necessarily our job for sources to like what we write. I mean, they should feel that it's accurate and that it's fair. But it's tough. I mean, with the story that I'm sort of going through this again now with this other story about Michelle Carter and Conrad Roy, because that's being developed into a show, and I'm now back in touch with the families. And, you have to remind yourself in these situations that the parents of children who die have gone through like the worst trauma you can go through in this world, basically. And that influences how they are going to read stuff and how they respond to a work of journalism. And it's important, I think, to be mindful of that when we're working. But the short answer is the families didn't like it, and the friends were more looked on it more favorably.
I think as journalists, and particularly as financial journalists, we're used to we're forced to try and develop a bit of a thick skin. We deal with some pretty aggro companies or PR representatives, and often we'll write stories that, people don't want us to write, like whether it's people in positions of power or people who run big organizations or even politicians. And you have to get used to taking criticism when stories come out. But I think it's a totally different beast when the criticism is coming from individuals who aren't media savvy, from people who don't understand how, organizations like the New York Times operate, or who aren't prepared for like a huge story like this to come out. And I think that, or I could imagine that would be difficult, or probably more challenging as a reporter to get past and to try and think about when the criticism comes from individuals like Jamel Moore's mother, as you were saying, rather than if it was coming from the police or the communications department of the police. Right. And how did you get through that, and how did you feel about that?
I try to view it as part of the story, as part of the events. Like if you're reporting the events as a journalist, you look at the response as a journalist, and it's just a fact. In the same way that the fact that the cops saying stores closed is a fact. Jamel's mother not liking the piece is a fact. It's not, our emotions are not the emotions that matter in our work.
Great answer.
Is and earlier, answer, but I think it's true.
Yeah, no, I think it's true. And earlier you mentioned that you made some mistakes along the way in your reporting process. I wonder, can you give us an insight into some of those mistakes, or what are some regrets that you may have looking back?
Yeah, there's so many things that I could have done better. There's, I think the things that are the most frustrating are when you miss someone who belonged in the piece, but you didn't quite get to them. And, for good or bad, someone who had a nefarious influence or a positive influence on the events. And so just as one, as one example, I'll give two. One example was there was a guy who was the publisher of the magazine that the white journalist at the beginning breaks the story in, and I didn't include him, and he felt excluded and hurt that I had missed him. Completely valid. That's a total, in general, editors aren't name checked in magazines, but I understand why he's upset, and like, that's how it is. One of the things that I felt saddest about was that I wasn't able to include as much from the sex worker activist community as I wanted to. And it's difficult because, you spend so much time with these people. You greedily consume their time, hours in some cases, over the course of a year and a half, you're talking to people a lot. And then you might use like one sentence. And that is, as a journalist, sometimes necessary, but also occasionally sort of saddening. And there was insights from the sex worker community that I thought were really potent that just didn't make it because there was not space, or it felt like it didn't fit. And it's just one of the sad things about writing in print is that you can't do everything. You're constrained by the actual signatures, the actual pages that will ultimately be printed.
Right. We've got a question here from Mike. He's a fellow board member at NIFL with me. He's asking, hey, were you reporting on other stories at the time that you were working on this piece? Because is it possible to multitask when you go so depth into a story like this?
I was, yeah. I did a piece about mail-in voting that came out, that I started after I started the Ed Buck piece, but came out before, just because the Ed Buck piece was so slow, in a magazine called California Sunday, which I actually think just closed. I hope not because my piece was so terrible, but the timing is rather eerie. But I did that while I was doing this, and I was writing some criticism for Book Forum while I was doing this. I do think you would go a little crazy if there weren't any anything else to think about over this kind of period of time.
Mm-hmm. And then we've got a question here from Amanda as well. When you write, do you think about the scenes as if you're turning them into a film? Is that a factor for you in choosing stories?
You know, I think that, no, I don't, but I do think that there's things you can steal from film and TV that are useful. And to sort of answer this question a little bit obliquely, I'm thinking about this a lot now because the story about Michelle Carter is being made into this Hulu show, and I've been in the writer's room watching them turn this material into a fiction show. And it's been really interesting to watch how they think about story and how visually they think about story. And it can be useful to steal some of that stuff as a writer in the same way that, like, a writer in, the 19th century would have, stolen from music or stolen from opera or whatever, stolen from photography. It's just another thing you can have in your toolkit, a way of storytelling, more visually. But I think having been through the experience of something getting optioned and like go to the stage of getting made, it is such a random, ridiculous crapshoot of like what actually gets turned into a film or a TV show, that if you tried to design in advance to pick stories that you thought were going to make good shows or TV, I think you would go absolutely out of your mind, because it's so random and it's so crazy what actually goes on to get something made. I just think like that way lies misery.
Could you talk a little bit about your own writing process, and when you sit down with what I imagine is like tens of thousands of pages worth of notes, and then documents, and then audio interviews, and then written notes? How do you condense it all into a first draft?
The first thing I do is I transcribe all my tapes. I use Rev, which I'm looking for another option if anyone knows of more ethical ways to do this, because I think Rev has changed their rates and like underpays their transcribers a lot now. But I transcribe all my tapes. I reread all the transcripts. That's like my first port of call. And then I try to start arranging things often like physically. With this piece, me and Sarah, would like sit down with all of the material and we would start putting stuff into different piles, and you'd be like, this vaguely has to do with the ballroom house. This vaguely has to do with Buck's history in Phoenix. This vaguely has to do with West Hollywood. And when you start to physically see what it is that you have, that hints at what your sections should be, right? If you have like a big pile of paper and it's all about West Hollywood, you're gonna have a West Hollywood section. If you have another big pile and it's all about the ballroom house, that's gonna need to be a section. And once you have that, then you can start to like make cards. And I have, like a cork board in my office, and I do the card thing. But I actually think the card thing can be a little bit of like a time wasting procrastination tool, because you can perfect the little structure, and then when you actually start to write, it doesn't work. But that's sort of how I think about it, is like what belongs together. And I guess in general, this is very simplistic, but I basically think there's two kinds of sections in magazine pieces: narrative and thematic. And a narrative section would be like the first section of this piece, where it's like an hour before sunset, this is what happened, and therefore this happened, and therefore this happened, and therefore this happened. And the other kind of piece is thematic, which would be the section that begins, West Hollywood is an insulated place. I know there's a lot of variety, and that's kind of not true, but basically I sort of believe it is true. And you're really picking one or the other when you're writing. So you try to have some kind of balance of like narrative and theme and whatever. And it comes out of this process of like looking at gathering everything and starting to understand the story, and then looking at what you have and organizing it into these different islands. And I guess the last thing is that with crime, it is a little easier, because 9 times out of 10, you're beginning with the event, right? You're beginning with the thing that everyone is trying to solve. It's an unusual piece where there's something else that is as powerful or as significant a way to begin as the night of. Some pieces you can do it, but for the most part, you have to have a good reason, I think, if you're not going to at least audition that as your first section. So that gives you a hint of where to start, and then you start to sort of follow.
Thanks for that. That was great advice. I wonder, do you think Ed Buck read your piece?
I'm sure he knows about it because I wrote to him in jail, and he responded sort of to his lawyer to me. So I know he knows about the piece and about me. I'm sure Chris Darden read it because he was photographed for it. Um, Whether Buck actually read it in prison, I don't know. I know he knows about it, you know. Maybe he did. I don't know. I didn't. I didn't get a letter to the editor from Buck. We can say that for certain.
Well, we're almost nearing the end of the time now, and I just have 3 rapid fire questions for you to kind of summarize. Sure. The first one is, what was your biggest takeaway from this piece?
You mean like as a writer or the themes of the piece?
Yeah. What did you learn?
As a writer? Or is it, or is like as a writer?
I guess as a writer, as a journalist, like what's something that you learned during producing this story?
You need way less. The kinds of power that matter in LA are like race and housing more than almost anything else. And I've only been here for 3 years, and it was like I sort of knew it, but it was eye-opening to see it up close.
And what do you hope that your readers took away from this piece?
That like what I say in the end, that, you know, that like life in a city like Los Angeles is an emergency for some people and not for others, and that we've got to be, you know, more alert to the way that power like that functions in the cities where we live.
I actually love that line that you had, and I have it here on my laptop because I wanted to bring it up before the end. You wrote that how Banks had told you not to get confused about the story, that it wasn't about one guy and his appetite. It was about how life in Los Angeles is an emergency for some people and not for others. Someone was always willing to take advantage of someone else's struggle to survive. What's crazy is there's so many more Ed Bucks out there, she said, and even more people who are vulnerable to them. That's such a powerful paragraph. And the last question I have for you is, you know, there are a lot of people on this call probably who would love the chance to write a piece like this, to pitch an ambitious story like this. What should we as financial journalists learn from your story, and how can we produce similar stories like this in the future?
I would say, like, for me, I just like, don't be afraid of starting to pursue stuff before you know what it is. I spend a lot of time on dead ends, And I think like it's something that no one explained to me when I was young. I started by working at Harper's. I didn't go to journalism school. I interned and then was a fact checker and an assistant editor, fact checker. And I feel like no one explained to me how much like trial and error and just like sort of groping around in the dark is part of reporting. And I always thought I was doing something wrong when I would spend so much time and then like a source would pull out, or there was nothing there, or it wasn't that interesting. And it's really only recently, as I've written a little bit more, that I've gotten comfortable with like that part of the reporting process. And I feel like for younger, I mean, I'm not like I'm speaking to you guys from some position of authority. I barely know what I'm doing. But I do think that this sort of like fearlessness with pursuing stuff that might not pan is like kind of the key. Because like the Buck story, I started way before he was arrested, way before anything. And it like, this happened to be one where there was a lot to do. But for every story like this that I write, there's like 3 leads that just crash land for some reason. And that's okay. You know, just like start reporting stuff before you're confident that it might be a story, and you will find the story.
Well, that's a fantastic place to end. Jesse, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me so much.
It was, really, really interesting responses, and really appreciate all your advice and wisdom. And thank you for everyone who joined us tonight. And a special shout out to Britt, the Executive Director of the New York Financial Writers Association. Please join us for future events. We'll tweet them out and we'll be sending them out via email. Thank you, everyone. And thanks especially to you, Jesse.
Thank you guys so much for listening and being here. Have a great night, everyone.